Hello, and welcome to Shetown, a remembrance and a celebration of the extraordinary mill women of Dundee. 3 weekly parts will begin with the story of the mill women and continue to focus on design development process, featuring elements of the contemporary clothing and the creation of a capsule collection intended for homemaker patterns. I live in Dundee. I live in a mill and work in a mill. My studio is in Meadow Mill, and the view from my studio window is yet another mill called Verdant Works. I've often mused over why the mills were given these names, Meadow and Verdant. As we say in Scotland, aye right, maybe there was a meadow, and it was very likely very verdant indeed, but not in the time of the mills. As a Glaswegian who has now lived in Dundee for over 13 years, I'm very interested in the historical aspects of my adopted home. So I was very intrigued when I first found out that Dundee, in the latter half of the 19th century, became known all over the world as Shetown. This from the Verdant Works Museum. Women outnumbered men 3-1 in the mills, an imbalance in the labour market that gained Dundee the nickname of Shetown. It created a unique and tough breed of women, born out of being the main providers for the family. With so many women working in the mills, it was left to the unemployed men to look after the babies and cook the meals, which earned them the name of kettle boilers. I had initially thought the nickname Shetown was positive, cool even, on the side of the women. However, there's that negative and derogatory moniker, kettle boilers, or kettle boilers, widely used at the time to describe their menfolk. As we can see from the contemporary images, any man adopting the perceived role of a woman was ridiculed, and vice versa. And of course, the women's situation in Dundee was not the norm. Here's the ideal, beginning with the wooing part at the top left and the subsequent one prized domesticated wife. And there she is on the right, with the baking, the stove on, the floor bucket and the washing all done, hanging out to dry. Oh, and a book propped up in front of her. There's a caption, "The Woman Who Will Read." It seems that you could squeeze in some reading as long as you're doing the chores at the same time, maybe even when your husband isn't about. This then is the angel in the house, as was the expected ideal of married women of all classes. So at the time, Shetown was meant as a jeery, sneery name then. Oh. I wanted to find out more about Dundee's Shetown mill women and to understand how their unique situation came about. What was life like for them? What were they up against, and what were they like? What I found out made me want to remember them with pride and celebrate these extraordinary women in some way, in my own way. In 1838, the first Dundee jute mill was opened. The city was a world centre for the manufacture of the fabric. At its peak, there were 150 jute farms with 40,000 people dependent on the industry for their livelihoods. The city became known throughout the world as Jutopolis. What was it like to come and work and live in Bonnie Dundee then? To start a new life? This from Tour Scotland. Dundee more than doubled its population in a period of some 20 years in the 19th century. Such was the demand for labour that many of the disposed from the Highland clearances came for work. Many more from Ireland were shipped across to the west coast and brought to Dundee in cattle trucks, where they were put into ready-made slum dwellings by the mill owners. One area of the hill town became known as Candleland, because the gas company refused to put in gas in case the occupants committed suicide. In 1863, the average life expectancy for a Dundee man was 33. This from Friends of Dundee City Archives. An observer who came to the city in 1853 found spectacles so disgusting that one could scarcely conceive their existence possible in a civilised country. Overcrowding led inevitably to poor sanitary conditions. Diseases such as cholera, typhus, and smallpox were rife and contributed to Dundee having one of the highest death rates in Scotland and the highest infant mortality rate. Evidence of the very poor general state of health of the population was provided in 1904, when 50% of the men who volunteered at the local army recruiting office were rejected as being unfit for military service. Professor Darcy Thompson recalled his first impressions of the city in 1884. Dundee was terribly poor. When I first came here, the green market was full of idle men walking to and fro, hungry and in rags. Of all those young professors who had come to town, I doubt if there was not one who was not shocked and saddened by the poverty which Dundee openly displayed. Dundee was worse even than the slums of London, Glasgow, and Liverpool. It was of course a common and worldwide practice to use female and child labour in mills at this time. This image is of a young girl in an American mill. And here I doff my cap to the famous Lowell mill girls, the young mill workers of Massachusetts, who in the 1830s organised and mobilised to strike and were the first to form a union. Dundee mill owners would readily employ married women, which was not common practice, and it was indeed frowned upon by those who considered themselves the better sort. A quote from an ex-weaver of the time: "If anybody got married, it was an awful slur if they had to go back to work. It was only the mill workers that went back. Outside the mills, very few women, when they got married, worked." Eleanor Gordon states that the reason women were viewed as cheap and unskilled source of labour was because women were assumed to be dependents who were reliant on the earnings of a male provider and therefore did not require the same level of earnings as men. But as we have seen, it's the women who got the vast majority of work in the Dundee mills, so not dependent, but paid cheaper rates nonetheless. And this at a time when Dundee is quoted as possibly having the lowest wages in Scotland with the highest cost of living. Added to the harsh reality that your children also had to work is the knowledge that they would only be earning half-time money, as they would have been expected to attend school the other half of the day. Well, at least their children were given an education, half of the time anyway, and it would seem that they would also have had something of a childhood, as they would not be labouring in the mills until they reached the statutory age. Oh, good then. There is stark evidence to the contrary. This from Friends of Dundee City Archives. The Dundee School Board was notorious for providing more exceptions than any other city, allowing children to work at an early age. Other children borrowed certificates from older siblings to get work at an earlier age than was allowed. They then laboured for long hours in poor working conditions, with little consideration for safety standards. In these dangerous conditions, accidents were common. In his 1899 report, the Chief Inspectors of Factories declared, "He has never seen anywhere children of poorer physique than the Dundee half-timers, very diminutive, and the arduous nature of their duties and the high temperatures which they have to withstand render them emaciated and paid to degree." As the Verdant Work says, "Be glad that you're not one of the child workers of old, who laboured 15 hours a day in the mills of old, who in one case were kept awake by taking them by the nose and enduring cold water over them. Equally, the job of wet spinning was nasty. After spending all day being sprayed with hot water, youngsters would leave the mill barefoot and sodden." Here we have an official warning poster of possible workplace hazards from our own time. Let's compare with the possibilities, or rather undoubtedly certain outcomes in many cases, for the mill workers. This then the alternative for these women to being the angel in the house. To have this for your children, and indeed for yourself when you were a child and as an adult. However, as Gordon points out, poverty and dearth of employment for men may well have been the factors driving women out to work, but there is evidence that they took pride in the fact that they worked hard for their money. In the decade prior to the First World War, there were strikes across the UK. For example, in 1912, the jute workers of Dundee took to the streets. In the beginning, the strike seemed to be of good-humoured nature, with much singing of the slogan, "We will never be content till we get our 10%. However, this was reported in a local newspaper as marchers singing war songs. This from the Socialist Courier blogspot site. As the strike wore on, tensions began to rise, with the employees of Cox Brothers and Lockheed becoming particularly militant. The company was so alarmed by the depth of feeling amongst the workers that they took serious measures to protect themselves and their factories in the event of riots, and ordered 20 pistols of the type that would fire up to 32 shots without reloading. The women had their part to play in the strikes, as reported in the Dundee Advertiser in 1906. Strikers invaded the Cowgate. In a twinkling, a circle, the diameter of which extended from the Queen's statue to the portals of the shelter, was formed, and a couple of score of shrieking, shouting spinners spun round in the gyrations of a jingle ring. Ere long, Panmure Street was thronged from end to end by an uproarious crowd of lassies. Number gave them boldness, and they made a rush for the shelter, in which the most part milliners were seeking to escape personal illusion and recognition, and had taken refuge. A hooting band made a rush for the last door, but the police, who acted with commendable discretion, intervened, and the portals were closed. The Reverend Williamson reported at the time that he would often see, as he put it, tousled, loud-voiced, battle-eyed, defiant lassies gathered together in Lockheed Road, discussing, with animation and candour, the grievances that had contained them to leave their work. These women's strikes were seen as spontaneous, unorganised, and somewhat irrational, ineffective affairs. However, Eleanor Gordon points out that they were spirited and defiant, ridiculing, teasing, and challenging patriarchal authority, targeting the haunts to invade the territory of the employers and merchants, catcalling and heckling to puncture their dignity, thereby asserting their own authority and independence, not only from the masters, but also from the male-dominated unions. They liked dressing up in a comical manner, carrying effigies of their targets, hilarity, dancing, singing, wearing men's hats and policemen's helmets. I like this from Tour Scotland. The women of Dundee were reputed to have the most beautiful hair in the world. This is because of the fact that after leaving the mill at night, they would spend so much time brushing the jute out of their hair. And out of necessity, they were the mothers of invention. Eleanor Gordon writes that despite the pressures of earning from piecework and the restrictions of their supervision, the women would find time to gather for a chinwag with their friends, reported as having a slack time. And they would rush to help a co-worker, even though it would cost them stoppage time. And they even developed lip-reading skills and a repertoire of sign language in order to communicate with one another over the literally deafening din of the mill. As she says, in this way, information about the events of a previous evening, or the impending marriage of one of the girls would be passed from one end of the factory to another. In 1904, the Dundee Courier reported that a minister who had been visiting Dundee commented on the kindness of the Dundee poor, saying that he had seen so much which was touching and beautiful, stating that few cities could have such a list of benevolent lady workers who made the burdens and sorrows of their poorer brethren their own intimate and close concern. In an article from Cordwainers Garden site, the women are described as follows. Dundee's mill workers were the main breadwinners and householders. According to the wonderful Verdant Works Museum, in the face of such circumstances, any fixed ideas of what constituted normal male and female behaviour were dismissed, and Dundee women gained the freedom to act in a way which often ignored convention. The local vicar called them overdressed, loud, bold-eyed girls, and drunkenness among them was common. So these were the women working on the heckling machines, who would be bold enough to question and confront their betters, hence the word hecklers. And these women were the bedrock of the subsequent suffragette movement in the city. An article from City Life Dundee explains there was a common practice of tattooing among the women of the urban poor, including the women mill workers. Particularly noted was a highly distinctive tattoo, an enigmatic combination comprising a heart visible on the back of the right hand, along with a tombstone concealed on the left forearm. The exact meaning and significance of this design is elusive, but it serves as a potent symbol of the fragility of life and love within the often unforgiving environment of Jutopolis. The Verdant Works Museum points out that the mill girls were noted for their stubborn independence. Overdressed, loud, bold-eyed girls, as we've heard from one observer, and often, quote, roaring fou with drink. City Life Dundee notes that the mill women had quite a reputation. While it was frowned upon for the non-working wives of the better sort of tradesmen to be seen in the pub, the working women of Jutopolis could hold their own with the men at the bar as well as on the shop floor. In fact, women mill workers were amongst the most resolute recidivists when it came to petty crimes, such as behaving while drunk in a disorderly and riotous manner. In 1905, it was recorded that a total of 30 out of 41 convictions involved workers within the jute industry, of which 27 were women workers. And here that same year, we have 16-year-old mill worker Margaret, with the peculiarities or marks of her tombstone tattoo on her left forearm and the heart on the back of her right hand. The Aberdeen People's Journal of 1902 reported, "The mill girls of Dundee are, to put it mildly, a caution. During the meal hours, when passing along, they carry all before them. Woe betide that unfortunate wight who attempts to dispute their right to the whole street." I'll leave you with this from Norman Watson, who in his thesis Daughters of Dundee reports the following published comments. And then to finish, I'll follow it with a gallery of some of the finest of those Dundee daughters of Sheetown.